Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. I'm Aida Mojallal, art teacher of this edition of Menart Fair 2025, section of Iran. I'm so happy, thank you Laura for giving me this chance of being here with two great speakers we have today. It's my honor to have Dr. Keshmirshekan from England and Madame Cathrine David. I will ask the speakers to introduce themselves later, after my introduction. So the subject of this roundtable is the role played by Paris in the avant-gardism and modern Iranian art. So we're talking mainly about 1940 and 1960. So in discussing the emergence of modern art in Iran, it's essential to situate it within the broader context of country's political, social, and cultural transformation. So this opening toward modernity did not begin in the 1940s. Cultural relations between Iran and France extended much further back. As early as the 18th century, the two nations maintained mutual relations through diplomatic missions, engineering projects, and scientific expeditions. It was, however, in 19th century under the Qajar dynasty that these ties acquired a distinctly cultural and artistic dimension. A notable example is Kamal al-Mulk, the leading court painter who undertook a 3-year trip to Europe from 1898 to 1901, notably to Paris, as a part of a government-sponsored mission during a Muzaffar Shah reign to further his artistic skill. By the early 1930s, Iran was undergoing a profound transformation. The country had emerged from Reza Shah's authoritarian rule and was moving toward modernization and increasing engagement with the West. Within this climate of reform came a decisive milestone, the foundation of the University of Tehran in 1934. Its master plan and several key buildings, including the National Museum of Iran, were designed by Henri Godard, a French architect, archaeologist, and art historian. A few years later, in 1940, this vision expanded with the establishment of the Faculty of Fine Art, Danishgah Honar Ziba, at the University of Tehran, modeled on the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. It was conceived by Godard and designed by another French architect, Roland Dubourg. Throughout this history, Paris remained a place of learning, experimentation, at times exile. From Sadr Hedayat, who first came to Paris in 1926 and later wrote his iconic novel, The Blind Owl, to Sohrab Sepehri, the poet and painter who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1950s, and Jalal al-Ahmad, whose observation of French society shaped his seminal Garbzadegi, Destructification. Paris offered Iranian intellectuals and artists formative encounter, a laboratory of ideas, and a mirror of self-reflection. So this is the story we will explore today, one of translation, adaptation, and creative exchange, where the spirit of Paris continues to resonate through the studios and galleries of Tehran. So I will ask Dr. Keshmirshekan to introduce himself.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me, yeah? Okay. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here next to, most admired. It's difficult to introduce myself, really. I'm just simply an art historian and art critic and writer. I've written on the subject of modern and contemporary art of Iran and also the MENA region, and organized a number of events, conferences, and a few exhibitions as well. So I think that's enough. So, but I mean, the introduction was really helpful, and I tried to very briefly encapsulate the idea of Iranian modern art or modernism very, very briefly in relation in particular to Paris and the art scene in Paris and its impact, the subject of this roundtable. You mentioned about Kamal al-Mulk and his trip. He was an iconic and very, very important figure, of course, in the past 100 years in Iranian art. And so, I'm not going to talk about particular place that Kamal al-Mulk has occupied in Iranian art history, but overall, the interesting point that you mentioned that he was one of the earliest art figures who just visited Europe and of course France in particular, and somehow observed some aspects of European art. Although not contemporary art of the time, which was Impressionism or post-Impressionism, but anyway. It was towards the end of 18th century. So we know that his influence on Iranian art, at least for several decades, and his so-called School of Kamal al-Mulk and its impact, and also through the next phase of introduction of modernism in Iranian art scene, which was 1940, as you mentioned, and the opening and establishment of Faculty of Fine Arts within recently established University of Tehran, a symbol of modernization in Pahlavi period, in Reza Shah. So, and you also mentioned about Godard, under Godard, who was particularly in charge of its establishment and application and adaptation of Beaux-Arts, École des Beaux-Arts and its system. And there were a number of French instructors who were particularly involved, and interestingly, those were the ones who were more popular among the students, the younger generation of Iranian artists who were very keen to learn about modern styles. And these French instructors, together with some of the Kamal al-Mulk's disciples who were now in charge of teaching and instructing students, introduced different, modern style which were based in France and Impressionism, and also post-Impressionism, Fauvism, for example. So again, that was quite obvious, that sort of impact, and also the presence of some École des Beaux-Arts educated instructors, Iranians, such as Mohsen Mohaddam, who was one of the founders of the faculty itself, and also teaching students and in charge of application of that system within the university. And also another important figure who was an architect, and then of course the dean of the faculty, Mohsen Fouroughi. I recently reviewed a book which is going to be published on Mohsen Fouroughi and the role of the École des Beaux-Arts in formation of modern Iranian architecture and the buildings, in particular in the first Pahlavi period. And so he was also in charge at the same faculty. And another interesting point that I would like to mention at that time, again, quite related to the topic of this roundtable and French impact on the formation of that particular period, was an exhibition, because during the 1940s and 50s, there was no particular venue that could host an exhibition of Iranian art, exhibitions of artists. And basically, different kinds of institutions and societies, including Iran-France Institute and Iran-Soviet Institute, were in charge of holding the first exhibitions of Iranian art. And interestingly, in 1945, one of the earliest exhibitions was somehow organized by the Iran France Institute, where the works of both modernists, these young students of the faculty, together with some more established artists and naturalists of School of Kamal work were exhibited there. But more importantly, the faculty was also very instrumental in training the new generation of Iranian artists who were the first pioneers of modern art in Iran as well, including, but not, these are just a few figures, Jalil Ziapour, Hossein Kazemi, and Jawad Hamidi. All three of them continued their study after the faculty at École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And so they were all very influential in the introduction of modernism, and particularly what I'm interested in is avant-gardism in the Iranian art scene of the 1940s. Ziapour was studied in particular on the under Lod's academy at the same time when he was studying in Beaux-Arts. And we know Lod was very influential and in training several non-Western students from the MENA region and Latin America, including Ziapour. And interestingly, many of his disciples were very revolutionary, including Ziapour. And when Ziapour came back after his studies, he was the main leader of avant-garde art and what he called Hunar No, or modern art in Iran, for at least 1 decade, together with a number of other avant-garde poets, musicians, other authors. So they just established very avant-garde, groundbreaking movement or groups or institute or association that was called Khoz Jangi, or Fighting Rooster. And they were all together. They did something that would join these all people, revolutionary people and figures, was that they were very much in charge of promotion and introduction of what they called modernism, or no-gerai in Persian. So, and something again that was interesting, and I know that this is the common spirit of non-Western modernism in different parts of the world, including the Arab world and, of course, the MENA region. And we see, in particular in Iran as well, that that sort of modernism that Ziapour and others were trying to introduce was not exactly the same modernism that they had understood during their studies. That was not exactly, for example, French modernism. So, and the main difference that would make somehow the spirit of avant-gardism in Iran was that, of course, they were groundbreaking, they were challenging the status quo, the situation, the other artist movements, including their professors and miniaturists, for example, the dominant kind of movements and practices of the time. But at the same time, they were really thinking how they could reconcile this modernism with some kinds of traditional or something that they call authentic culture of their own roots. So that is something that they were very much involved, and they were not only the ones, not visual artists, painters and sculptors only, but the same with novelists, poets, and also intellectuals in arenas of the country as well. So that is something that would make this kind of avant-gardism somehow different from what we know about avant-garde in, for example, 19th century Paris. So something that's called reappropriation of traditionalism and modernism together. So not really just copying or producing something quite derivative. Ziapour, for example, was doing some research about how, for example, he could digest some aspects of Qajar art, for example, or even some kinds of crafts and even lives of tribal people in different parts of the country and other artists of the same generation. The same, including Hossein Kazemi, who had studied at the École des Arts. Do I have still time to continue?
You still have 3 minutes.
3 minutes, all right, great. So this is something that it interests me a lot about this movement, and what I would really differentiate this generation even from the next generation, which enjoyed the governmental support, was that this generation in particular had no support whatsoever from the government. So they had to challenge everyone, including, of course, the establishments. And so they didn't have any financial support, and they were just fighting through these societies, galleries, discussions, and other things. But the other important event that happened, of course, that ended up with the post-Codes, particularly, and the establishment of اداره هنرهای زیبا, or fine art administration, and then they started gradually hiring these artists, and of course the Tehran Biennale in 1958, that was perhaps the time that modern artists somehow were able to be known and accepted as a kind of movement within the country. But in 1960, another important art establishment appeared, and that was Faculty of Decorative Arts. Again, somehow modeled after Art Deco Paris. And the dean of the faculty, who was in charge of this establishment, of Hossein Kazemi, who had studied at Art Deco in Paris. And through that particular faculty was that a new or second generation of Iranian modernists, who were also avant-garde and very revolutionary, came to the scene, and including artists that now we know as Saqakhane or new traditionalists. So they were even more in charge of creating something quite purely Iranian, rather than just following any path from pre-existing path or style or stylistic references. So through this faculty, students were introduced to Iranian past heritage, including crafts. And so through that, there were a number of artists that now we know as something that is called school or movement, that's called Saqakhane. And so, again, one of the known figures, Shah Hossein Zindaredi, also was in Paris immediately after, a few months of studying at the faculty. And then he was, of course, although living in Paris, but was in the art scene in Iran, very active, together with several other number of Iranian artists who were active in the Iranian art scene of the country at that time. Zindaredi, for example, was introduced to Lettrism, and then, interestingly, the kind of movement that now is known as calligraphic movement or neo-calligraphic movement was introduced to the art scene of Iran and, of course, the wider Middle East and MENA. So that is another very important impact of what we can, relate it to the Parisian art scene. So there were a few other number of activities that I would like to name. Just two: Sirouz Gallery, who was very active in Paris during the pre-revolutionary period, exhibiting the works of Iranian modernists in Paris, and also the exhibition in 1975, the first called the International Art Fair, where Parisian galleries exhibited alongside Iranian modernists in Tehran, and so there were, kind of very, very close relationships and exchanges at that time that unfortunately ended.
Thank you, Dr. Keshmirshekan. Obviously, the time is so short for a history of art. So I'm so sorry. So I asked Cathrine David, please introduce yourself to your audience, and then.
So I will try to be synthetical. So I am art historian, curator, and museum director, and depending on the different moments in my life, and I worked on many exhibitions, and maybe I will mention for what is maybe the most interesting in the frame of the context of Menart Documenta in Kassel in 1997. Contemporary, because it never happened in France, it always kept an English title, Contemporary Arab renditions, Beirut, and after Cairo, and after Iraq during the war. And the most recent, which is already 2014, in collaboration with my friend Mola Montazami, Connected History, Art in Iran, 1950, 2014. And so, I won't go back to the history of art in Iran, even so I know better from the 50s on than before. I know I saw works, but I'm not sure I would be able to elaborate as deeply as my colleague. And I will maybe insist on a few, let's say, bémol. I don't know in English how you say that, a few trying to really look back to what it meant in Paris as a capital, Paris as international center, what were the real conditions and what were the real effects of this situation. So first of all, we work with Paris, capital of the arts, but you have different moments. The late 19th century, which was already Paris was a mecca for artists coming from all over the world. It doesn't mean anything, but let's say from many countries. And after you have the moment we are always commenting, which is the very early 20th century, from 1905 until the late 30s. We have the main activities in Montparnasse, and where you see many, many artists coming and going to the many academies, which were, they call the Beaux-Arts, of course, but many artists, either because they were not accepted or because they could not follow, or they had to work for paying fees, they would better go to academies. And so what's also quite important is to figure out the different moments. Of course, you have different discourses and narratives, different cultural and political and social moments, so it's not exactly the same and producing fan effects. The other moment is more like from the late 30s up till the 50s. And of course, the war is a very special moment because many people leave Paris. There is not much to do. And the moment which, in a way, I know the best, not because I was there, I was not there yet, but because it's a moment where many artists began to work, artists whom I knew after the 50s, which is really like the 50s, let's say about till the mid, if we are generous, the late 60s. This is the end, when Paris will be much less attractive, and many, many artists would prefer to go to New York or to Berlin, which has to be activated because it's something between the night and the zoo, and you have to show a nice vitrine in order to pretend that you are better than the eastern part. So it's a very, very, all these moments, of course, you have different effects. One bemol I would see also is that it's not enough, to be in Paris, and it's sometimes very used by artists when they go back to their countries because it's a kind of reference, it's prestigious. But for people who stay in Paris, it's not necessarily easy, and you see that most of the time, and it has to do with what you said about the different modern attitudes. It's more like, I would see concentric circles. So, meaning that you have the modern art, and after what we call avant-garde happening. And you see that a lot of artists coming from non-Euro-American, and I would say non-Euro, North American, because South America is something a little bit different, a little bit in between. So let's say artists coming from non-North American, non-Western countries, they, in a way, they are in Paris, they study, and they do the work they are doing. Some are very good, but it never fits to a certain extent. And then you enter in one Patanter, the very famous Indian art historian, qualified as Nivenor, the failed Picasso. So meaning, when it's too good, it looks too much like Picasso, you are like a follower, you are like, in a way, repeating, copying the avant-garde. And if it looks too different from Picasso, that is the main codes of the avant-garde, you are not good or delayed, and you see, even in the biography of artists, we all know, because they've stayed in Paris for a long time, like Saïd Raza. I worked on his retrospective, and he spent 50 years in Paris, 50 years before he went back to die in India. And even though he was going back and forth to India after we had enough money position here, he was there. And when you look at his career, he was not really visible. The question of the presence is one thing, and another thing is the visibility. And sometimes I would write it a little bit Derrida way, invisibility. So meaning, if you don't fit with the canon of modern, you are not visible, or not as visible as other ones, because you have to be very subtle, because you have many different nuances and cases, but it's a little bit what happened. So I think it's really a kind of, there is like a double side to the story, because it's not necessarily a good deal for the artist to study maybe, but to stay. Another example, which is really like unbelievable, it's Saeed Sadekan, who is probably the most important, of course, Pakistani, but born in India before 47, and one of the major artists from his generation. He spent not continuous, because he was back to Karachi, he was traveling. But he was in Paris, 61, 65. He's shown in very important, but very well visible galleries on the AIDS area and so on. So it was not at all marginalized, the poor galleries or whatever. He had this exhibition, which we call now the Lost exhibition, which was planned for Maison de la Culture du Havre, and which he never did because his father became sick and he took him back to the holy sites in Iraq and after back to die in Karachi. And it's really like when you speak, I did the test with many people I know, including people very knowledgeable. No idea about Sadekan. So it's really, and even when you stay in I would say the golden circle of Indian people, you had the first exhibition of Raza in Paris in the early 50s, in gallery, don't remember the name, in close to Saint-Sulpice. And you had Raza, of course, but also Padamsi and Francis Newton Souza. It happened in, so Raza, because he was using certain proto-cubist or forms, it was accepted, and he was also very stubborn instead, and he organized himself. But Palamsi stayed a little bit and went back. And Sosa understood immediately that it would be better for him to go to London. And Sosa is absolutely, and look at the works at this time, that the portrait, the figures are absolutely impressive, and you have to be blind for not seeing Sosa. So, you know, we have to be very, very, very careful with this situation. And it has also to do with the fact that it's one thing, and sometimes, you know, when this kind of golden legend of the artist coming to Paris, coming to London, coming to Berlin, it's in a way good to a certain extent, but it's not necessarily helping to work on a more inclusive model. Because I don't believe it. I think if you enter in alternative modernities or parallel modernities, so I think that at the end of the day, we are all modern. Of course, you have probably sequencing, which has to be rediscussed. Because the point is that it's not everywhere the same and not happening everywhere at the same time. And it's very difficult to work on these issues because you have to be able to establish a paradigm. And the paradigm is a certain formal expression which is coming out from a specific cultural, political, sensitive moment. And when you want to come to that, this is the big problem, you have to know. So meaning you have to know what's happening in the countries, you have to be able to, you can't be universal in knowing everything. For, at least when I'm in China, I'm very happy to have Chinese friends translating for me, taking me around, because I won't be able to understand many things, but at least I try to do my own work and to understand. So meaning that it's, when you see exhibitions like Magicien de la Terre, for instance, where most of the non-Euro-American modern and avant-garde was excluded and replaced by a kind of materialist, folklore, whatever you wanted. None of the big names of modern India was there. It has to do with complete misunderstanding about what is the modern proposal coming from a place which is not necessarily Paris, London, or Berlin. This said, when you would look very carefully to the diversity of the production in Paris, in Berlin, in London, you would find very bizarre works which are not really fitting with the canon. But this will be another discussion. And I have to say that the interesting part is that probably you become more attentive, more interested in this heterogeneity, bizarrerie of the modern in the proper centers of Euro-American modern, when you make the detour through the non-Euro-American modernities, because it makes you much more sensitive, much more attentive to formal decisions, transformations, collage, and so on and so forth. There is also, when it comes to Paris, you can see that the artists who were accepted, and there is one I know very well, who I know from his still alive, it's quite interesting because at the time you would be accepted through with what I call the entrance ticket. So as soon as you were able, and sometimes this at the cost of not only understanding, simplifications, etc., but as nobody were able to be accepted or identified as cubist or surrealist, you were part of the club, meaning it was like what I call the entrance ticket. And when you look at different black works, especially what he did in the Latin force after when he had to leave Spain at the end of the Civil War, it's more inspired in African images and portraits, and very, very Africanized, which are articulating his own tragedy. Civil War, the wife dead, the child died dead, and so on and so forth. And it has nothing to do with Cubist. Right? It looks a little bit like, so it's okay. And he has also the support of Picasso, which was not possible. And after the surrealistic, it's absolutely misguiding, because when you look carefully to the Federal work, it's not about surrealism. Not at all. It's about kind of sometimes anthropomorphization of a Caribbean landscape and vegetation, a kind of reappropriation of certain religious rites, which are also very, many people wrote at the time, 1940, Jungle was ready, that it was the first post-colonial. So meaning that a certain number of people were able to read the paintings for what they were and not that the surrealists follow up or whatever. So I think we have to be very, very, very careful with this kind of, I would say, pseudo-welcoming. Because, it's like, it's very nice to welcome the artists, to give them, but not to the point that it's at the cost of the understanding and the reading of the works. It also happened, and it's not there, but I told you many times, so I think he knows, and we had many discussions about that. The last exhibition my colleague and friend Avant-gardism did in Musée Moderator on modern Arab art. Most of the artists were there because they were artists having studied in School of Fine Arts in Europe, in many, of course, in Paris. And I think it's very important to take this opportunity of showing the artist and having a kind of corpus which is giving access to the diversity in form of proposals. But I think for me it's also a problem not to, now it's difficult, I know it's difficult, but we have to work, not to take into consideration what was happening in the proper countries. Because when you do that, you see what's happening now. Following the appropriation of our modern Gulf, it's what it is, appropriation of the modern Gulf. As far as I know, our modern didn't happen in the Gulf. I mean, Iraq, it happened in Egypt, it happened in Syria, it happened in Lebanon, not in the Gulf. So, fine. But the problem is when it comes to falsification of the Baghdad School. And that's school is not the end of the 50s, it's much before. So, you have you could unfold and unfold and unfold. So it's what I call the devant, or in a way rethinking the presence of artists, non-Euro-American artists in Europe on a much more complex way. Because after that, you have it's like prolongating a certain level of misunderstanding. And leaving many people at the door. There's many people who were either very radical in their form of oppositions, or who were not acceptable in the canon because they didn't look like. So we have to be conscious about that.
Thank you very much, Madame David. Clarifying that the subject is quite complicated. So at the time that we are thinking about the role of Paris, we have to take on consideration as well the country by itself, and the movement by itself, and then how it being worked in Iran at the time. But I have a question for you, Dr. Keshmirshekan. I would like to know, as your point of view, how did Parisian artistic and intellectual environment influence the development of Iranian avant-gardist practices?
Thank you. I think I just answered this question through my first part of talk, and so as I said, Mrs. W very aptly discussed about the situation.
We can ask Cathrine David to respond to this question.
Yes, of course,
I would love to have your idea about how did Parisian artistic and intellectual environment influences the development of Iranian avant-gardist practices.
it depends on what the artists looked at, what they were interested in. And, it's really like very diverse. Sometimes an artist goes and he likes a certain discourse or text, and what he's doing has nothing really to do with what he saw. So it's very, very difficult the question. Maybe for many artists, and not only Iranian, at the end of the day, when you read the letters and correspondence, it's a certain idea of aesthetical practice, a certain idea of what it means to be. But in Iran we didn't speak of it because he didn't go to Paris, he went to Italy. The great Moisés, he was, is always identified as existentialist in French, I can say, existentialist. And from that point of view, especially when you see him in the wonderful movie by Mitra Farahani, Fifi or Le Rire, even in Tehran, even before coming to here, it was already existentialist. And we had that kind of meeting of a certain kind of freedom, a certain kind of it's very wild in his own time. So, it's really like a revelation. So it's very difficult to say that it will produce that or that. It depends.
I'd love to have your idea, Cathrine, and your point of view about in what way did modern Iranian art establish an international presence in parallel with other Middle Eastern arts and.
I think the presence after, when we would follow, it has also to do with the market in the last 20 years. So, sometimes Iranian art, and you'll correct me because I know a little bit what's happening in Dubai, a little bit in Paris and London, but I'm not, or in Los Angeles. But it seems to me that you had a kind of very sometimes confusing assimilation, and even with the regions, I'm always a bit surprised when I see some of my colleagues identifying the Gulf as Middle East. Gulf is not Middle East, it's not at all. It's not the same space on the map, it's not the same history, and it's surely not the same culture. The Gulf and Middle East and North Africa is very different. And I think Iran, for me, is very different. First of all, it's an Arab country, which I have to repeat sometimes to people that you don't speak Arabic, you speak Farsi as a beginning. And after that, this is more here I will really maybe bother you with my data, but what is fascinating for me is the cultural development, the common point you could see between the development of Iranian photography and Indian photography. Yes, there is something absolutely fantastic where you see that art, the medium is coming at the really in time, so meaning more or less exactly at the moment it's invented in Paris. You see that the medium is used by a culture in order to follow a certain kind of program, and the program has to do with the invention of the country. The invention of the landscape, the invention by invention I mean in French it would be called description, homage, description of the country, description of a very diverse people and so on and so forth. And in India it's a little bit different because India is colonized, so it will be both a tool of a control and a tool of emancipation. So meaning you have to be very careful. So because of the market, and when you go to Dubai, you have a lot of Arab artists, a lot of Iranian artists in the market. But I think that when you look at the works, it's very, very different. So I think that these days, if the world was perfect, I would prefer to have to look at works. And not, I'm not necessarily interested when people come to me and say it's Chinese art or this is Iranian art and so on and so forth. And again, I think that maybe it's maybe extending the question too far. But for me, one of it's not really a problem, but it's a fact which is sometimes becoming problematic, that you have the Dubai market interacting with the production in Iran and outside. And happens in Iran when you see what you see in many non-Western countries, that some of the very, very interesting artists, the very juicy ones, I would say, they are not traveling because they are too heterogeneous.
Beauché position is one of them, because it's most modern artist. It's contemporary to Avant-gardism, but somehow he was never celebrated. And he's a very important modern artist, very important.
So now it's more what we have to deal with, not to be attentive, because you have a kind of double mind.
Last question
Can I,
before
sorry,
yes.
can I just add a little
Yes,
bit
of course,
to this? Because, I mean, that's analytically very fascinating. What I would like to add is somehow historically about, because your question was particularly the differences perhaps. There were more similarities than differences in terms of, when we study modern art in the region. Because the question of, return to the past and the mixture of traditional material to authentic culture with modernism was the main question. Because we are all talking about, until now, about modern art rather than contemporary art. So, because, of course, in all, important countries in the region, in terms of their history of art, like Iraq, like Egypt, like Lebanon, like Syria, or Morocco, for example. What we know now about contemporary art is somehow it's been built on that base, of course. But maybe I was just thinking, because I'm teaching, modern and contemporary art of the MENA region, and just talking about different countries. What I have found that might be a little bit of difference in the modern time was that most of these countries that we now know as countries or Arab countries, for example, like Iraq, Lebanon, or even Egypt, they were somehow either colonies for several decades. They were colonies a part of, Ottoman Empire, and then of course after that under British or French kind of colonies, or under protectorate somehow. So they were, more close in terms of relationships. Of course, unequal relationships between colonized and, colonizer. But in that sense, Iran has never been a colonized country, although it was occupied for a few years after 1941 Allied troops, but not really formally colonized. So what I found particularly, for example, that something that these all artists, although they studied, for example, in Europe or regionally in the US, for example, they've never really wanted to purely copy or follow exactly the same path as what they had learned and seen there. And even those artists who have never been abroad or studied there, who were very active in avant-garde movements of the modern time and later. So, for example, one example is Saqqafane, for example. When you compare it with Saqqafane as a kind of local modernism in Iran, to, for example, Baghdad group of modern art, like Jawad Salim and others. When you see that, for example, in the works of Salim, you can see exactly stylistic reference to Cubism and Picasso, for example. But Saqqafane artists, at least initially, they were not really, in compliance with any particular style. You can't really attribute some of the early Safakhani works to any stylistic reference except to something that as large like abstraction, for example. So in that sense, I see that there is a little bit difference in that sense. It's an indirect modernism, indirect influences that you could see in the works of many artists in the European time. I don't know if it would help, but this is something that I found might be an interesting point about the differences between, or for example, in Egypt, for example, Surrealism was very, very direct. I mean, had very direct connection with actual Surrealism in Paris, and Breton was involved in some movements, but it never happened in Iran. That's such a close relationship between art scene and what was happening outside.
Thank you, Dr. Keshmirshekan, and I would like you to, if you have any questions, I can ask for our speakers.
Thank you to both of you. It was an amazing comment. I have a small question to each of you. Dr. Keshmirshekan, if I'm not mistaken, there was a scholarship for the best student to be sent in Europe, especially to Paris. Can you talk a little bit about that? Do you think that the best one was sent, or?
Yeah. I'm not certain, I'm not sure, but it had to be like that. But yes, there were scholarships, and I also read that, for example, Ziapur received some fellowship or scholarship from École des Beaux-Arts as well. So in that sense, some of them were sent through that sort of foreign scholarships as well. But basically, according to some documents, they had to be, the best students and graduates through certain kind of, judgments and committees to be able to be selected as the best students, like Ziapur and Hamidi, for example. A few of them went without scholarship as well. But that was the system, and I think that was the system not just in Iran, in other Arab countries, as I said, for example, in Iraq and in Egypt. And many of the early students there were from kind of wealthy families, so that, or diplomats, to be able to be there to use that kind of chance, but not Ziapur, for example, or Hamidi in Iran.
Thank you. And Catherine, you mentioned something very interesting, the invisibility of these artists in Europe or wherever. Do you think this is because of the lack of market, or because of the non-integration of these artists to the society? Or how do you explain this non-visibility of these artists?
I think it's really like you have different levels, so it's a different kinds of visibility, or sometimes close to invisibility. So it has to do with many things. It has to do with networking, functioning or not. It has to do with what the artist is doing. If it's something easily that you can integrate easily in the canon, or it's something a little bit resisting to the taste or to the what people know, are able to identify, and so on and so forth. And it has also to do with the market and where you are showing, which is not again necessarily enough, because in the case of Sadiq Khan, he had a very good gallery, and he had this amazing book published in the early 60s, which was published by the Automobile Club de France, which was nothing less than the illustrations for a Camus, l'étranger. So it was not, and the book came out after Camus killed himself on the road. So, it's very, very, they could really deserve case studies, because you're very, very different. The thing is, the way I see, depending on the many artists I knew, whether they were South American or Asian, so you have like concentric circles. And And after you were black, and I knew very well Finland, so I could see, because I was with him often, that in his apartment, you have the cream of the Latinos from the time, and the Queue de la Comète, the end of the surrealist years, mixing with that, but it was like a circle. You won't see crossing with younger people or circles around Sonaland, or it was really, really. It's the way I see it. But I think for the integration is not so obvious, even for the acquisitions. Of course, you have works which were bought by a few museums, Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. It's part of his mission, plus its mission. It's supposed to deal with artists working and living in Paris, but not all of them, not systematical. So it's a very, very complex history. I think when we would work on a map, it would be more like islands. Around one artist, or around, you at the moment, I don't know their names, very important cinetic groups. A group in the late 60s, early 70s, and in Saint-Germain, so it was very active, and it was cosmopolitan, Latinos, Latin American, French, and so on. But it never really became dominant.
Can I just add a little bit something that was very interesting point? I've just written a chapter in my recent book. It's called Exhibiting Essentialism, Exoticism and its Attendant Uniformity, which is related to how our non-Western artists are perceived in your exhibition system and market as well. And also talking about reception and politics of representation, how visibility could be defined, and in what condition they could be visible, which is very interesting. It's again about the idea of, I've used the idea of exhibitory order, which is written by Mitchell, a post-colonialist author. Which is something about 19th century, and how non-Western cultures are defined within the Western culture. And also he talks about there are three actual items or elements that are at work, including essentialism. So they had to address, for example, something that they are supposed to be defined by that culture. For example, if Islam is a part of that definition, they had to show that elements. If politics is something, for example, about, wave, chador, or that sort of things, that would be an element that would define essentialism, and that would be a vehicle through which the artist could be visible. And another one, the otherness, though that should help the definition of otherness. So something that would define self, which is the West, and of course otherness. So again, that sort of things, if they exist in the work, they could be visible, otherwise it's not. And also absence, neutrality. So something which is interesting to see in many, many exhibitions that have been defined as Middle Eastern, as, for example, the national, like Iranian or women, that kinds of exhibition. So there are pre-existing readings of cultural cliches which are at work really. And of course, one of the very interesting example, which is exceptional, the works that Cathrine David as curated, unedited history was one of them, was whatsoever would address that sort of cliches. And of course, she could tell us how it's been received, that sort of approach. I mean, in comparison with Light of the Middle East that was held in the Victoria and Albert Museum, this is exactly very cliche Orientalist kind of colonialist view of, Middle East. So that was predefined and would simply go through that system, which is not really something that would be acceptable.
question? Yes?
My name is Raya. I'm from San Francisco, and I was wondering during your talk, I didn't hear any female artists' names, so mostly they were male artists. And particularly, I would like to hear more about Mrs. Iran. So if you could elaborate more.
Is it a question for me?
Yes.
Or?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think it was quite accidental, and I do apologize because those names that are known in the history of modern Iranian art, at least first generations, all male artists. But there were, of course, several female artists, Jad Sadr, Munir Farhan, many others after. Yes, of course. You have mentioned Jad Sadr. And so there were very many, of course. I mean, maybe fewer than male artists, but I mean, that was absolutely iconic and, of course, influential, their presence. So they have been involved and they have been very active. At least the second generation of modernists from the 1950s onwards. So it doesn't mean that it was quite accidental. And so please forgive me in that sense. But I didn't really want to address any kind of gender issues or any priority given to the male artists at all. I mean, that was something that there are simple examples of the books. I didn't name many other artists.
Just by saying their names, it's
No, sure.
Thank you. Is there any question, or can we finish the round table? So thank you very much, Cathrine David. Thank you very much.